We lived in the UK until our oldest was about 2.5 years old, and while we were there, we attended the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin, an Anglican congregation with a rich 1,000-year history. The music was stunning, the preaching was inspiring, and the community was lovely. It was a wonderful place to be. Like many or most Anglican congregations, at St. Mary's, children do not receive communion until they've had their first communion instruction. Having also received my first communion in about third grade after special classes, I respected that tradition, even though I'd learned that in the Orthodox Church, even the tiniest babies receive communion. Informed by this tradition, my pastoral internship supervisor in New York always gave communion to any baby who reached for it and figured that communion instruction should start early and last a lifetime. One was never really ready, she reasoned, and one was never really done learning. She, of course, convinced me of this theology. But at St. Mary's, little kids didn't take communion. And one day, when I was kneeling at the rail with my oldest, he proclaimed, "Mommy, I want a snack too." His desire echoed through the medieval stone building, and several older folks giggled and smiled. But he didn't get to have a wafer that day because he was deemed too young. He did get a blessing, of course, but that's not really what he was after that day. On the other side of life, I once heard a story about a longtime member of a church who suffered from dementia. Her pastor was part of a theological tradition that practices what is called close or closed communion. This means that only people who can demonstrate that they understand what communion is, either by being members in good standing at that congregation or by answering questions ahead of the service in a meeting with the pastor, are allowed to partake of it. This person's pastor determined that because of her dementia, she could no longer possibly understand the meaning of communion, and so he could no longer, in good conscience, allow her to receive it. I was pretty taken aback by the story of someone with dementia being denied communion. Perhaps one of the only things that might still have helped her connect with God in these last days of her life. Now, even though I grew up with the idea of First Communion, I did also grow up in the tradition of open communion, a theological position that says that none of us can possibly understand the mystery of God's presence in and among us in communion. And so if we approach this table in good faith, that is enough. None of us are free from sin at any given point, and so none of us are worthy on our own. Beyond all of this, this is Christ's table, so it's not my role to be gatekeeper. It's my responsibility to be generous with this gift that, at its heart, seeks the unity of all of God's people around a holy meal. To take from Luther's words, I would rather sin boldly so that God's grace might abound more fully than err on the side of being miserly with God's love. Today's gospel comes to us in the midst of several of Jesus' teachings, and it's split in a way that I think is unhelpful. But the connection between the two distinct parts of this text is that Jesus is lifting up those who are most often cast aside by our communities as unimportant. Throughout this gospel, Jesus' major concern is the restoration of relationship through healing, through teaching, through meals, and ultimately through the cross and the resurrection. When the Pharisees ask Jesus their question about divorce, he at least has an inkling that they are trying to see how much leeway they have in casting aside a wife who no longer suits their needs for whatever reason. In Jewish law at Jesus' time, a man could initiate divorce proceedings for any reason, but a woman could not. And of course, a woman who had been divorced was ultimately ruined. She was not easily able to be married again, and because she couldn't own her own property, she had no means of supporting herself. She was seen as property that could be used and disposed of. Marriage was often more about economic necessity and protection than love, and divorce was mostly at the whim of the man. In this text, which has so often been misused to keep people in abusive relationships, or in some traditions, to keep divorced and remarried people from communion, we can instead see Jesus interpreting the law to defend the lives of the very most vulnerable. For the Pharisees and others who would have looked to loopholes that would have allowed them to abuse their power, Jesus reorients them to the intention of the law, which is to help us grow in love and inclusion towards one another. Of course, sometimes it's necessary for a marriage to be dissolved. The people in the midst of that situation need to be treated with love and care, and the most vulnerable need to be protected and included as full and celebrated members of the community. As we've experienced Jesus' teachings and healings these past few weeks in this extended section of Mark's Gospel, Jesus continues to center the very most vulnerable. Our ultimate concern is not our status or how following Jesus will help us as we seek to be more important, or how easily we can get rid of someone who has become inconvenient. Our ultimate concern is always who is lonely, who is on the outside, who do we exclude, and how can we intentionally include? This table, which is really Jesus' table, was never meant to be behind a checkpoint. The gifts of God's grace have always been meant for everyone. Jesus never instituted a test to ensure that those who approached his table would be worthy. Instead, Jesus ate with those whom society most despised. He healed those who asked and those who didn't. And he consistently sought to lift up those who suffered the most in society. Speaking to us through a nearly 2,000-year-old text, Jesus shows us that our own calling is to lift up the most vulnerable and those whom our own society would cast out, inviting them enthusiastically to his table. Communion is not a prize for the perfect, but rather a means of God's grace, given for all of God's children, connecting us all to each other and reminding us that none of us are worthy on our own, but that all of us are made worthy by God's love. Amen.